Hey there, guys. Welcome to today's devotional thought. So, we are in Romans chapter 14 today. I've told you I love the book of Romans. I love Romans 14 because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding in Romans 14, and I want to just add some clarity to that. So, Paul introduces this concept, this idea of what we call the weaker brother. And there's been a lot of confusion over the years, mainly because I don't think we understand the context of what was going on in the first century. So, I want to add just a little bit of clarity to this. I hope this helps you maybe better understand not only the first century, but also what principle that we can apply to us today as believers in Jesus Christ. And so let me just tell you a little bit of the story. So in the first century, obviously Christianity is starting to grow. Because it's starting to grow, Christians are starting to become marginalized. Part of that was that they were being killed. Part of that was that they were losing their jobs. For the most part, they were just suffering. And so they had to figure out a way to exist in a culture that did not accept them. Very much similar to how we're living today as Christians, I believe. Maybe not as extreme, but still we feel that pressure today. And so one of the things that Christians were struggling with was they were just running out of money. They didn't have money. And so they were having to figure out what we would call today life hacks, how to save money, how to do things at maybe a little better rate. And so one of the things they figured out was that you could actually buy meat from the pagan temples at a reduced rate. Okay. And so what would happen is people would go to the pagan temples, Baal, Moloch, some of these guys, and they would offer a sacrifice. But they wouldn't sacrifice the entire lamb or cow or dove or whatever it was. They would only sacrifice a portion of it. And then the leftover meat, they would sell at a reduced rate. And so a couple of Christians who basically just didn't have a lot of money, they thought, well, we could buy meat, or we could buy meat from the pagan temples, save a little bit of money. Maybe we can exist for a little bit longer. Well, there was a group of Christians who said, hey, you shouldn't be buying meat from a temple. That's sinful. That's not right. And so Paul writes this letter to the church in Rome to say, hey, I've heard about the two groups. Some of you think it's wrong. Some of you don't think it's wrong. It's caused division in the church. And so I just want to give you my insight on this. I want to tell you what God thinks about this. And this is where Paul comes up with that term, a weaker brother. Now, here's where the confusion sets in. So I grew up in the church, and I was always taught that the weaker brother was the person who ate the meat. I thought because they didn't have faith, they didn't trust God, whatever it was. Paul actually tells us in Romans chapter 14, he actually mentions this in 1 Corinthians too, that the weaker brother is not the person who eats the meat. It's actually the person who doesn't eat the meat because he thinks that eating the meat is sinful. And what Paul goes on to say here is that in the New Testament, under Jesus Christ, there is freedom. If you are making extra rules for yourself that go above what Scripture tells us, then you are the weaker brother because you are living in bondage to these false ideas. And so Paul writes this letter to say the weaker brother is actually the person who adds extra laws onto God's. And so what I've always thought from this was that, hey, whenever we're making a decision about morality, about right and wrong, we're going to go directly to Scripture. And when we start adding on to Scripture, that's when we start to find ourselves in trouble because we're adding on to what God is saying. Now, I want to add on to this because some people could take that in a very negative way. And so Paul mentions this a little bit here in Romans, but he also mentions this in greater details in 1 Corinthians, where he says, let me give you this scenario. Imagine that you are having a party and you're one of those people, you're like, it's meat, it's not a big deal. And so you're going to go to the market and you're going to buy some meat, but you know that there are people that are coming over that would be offended by that. How should you respond to the weaker brother? And here's what I love about Paul's statement here. Paul doesn't say, hey man, that's their issue. They got wrong thinking. They got to figure it out at some point. Don't be held back by them. No, what Paul says is he says, we do everything to keep our brother from stumbling. And so if you're going to have a party and you know there are some people there and they're going to be offended by this, then don't buy the meat from the market because we don't want to do anything to bring false guilt, false conviction upon them. We want to respect them. We want to honor them. And so let me just give you a modern day example of this. So grew up in a very Christian home, very conservative school. And so, I just was always aware that whenever somebody would get into my car, I didn't know what convictions they would have. And so I've never felt convicted about listening to country music. I've never felt convicted about listening to R&B music. I love Christian music. I love country music. I love R&B music. I love all types of music. But I realize that some people getting in my car may have a certain conviction I don't. And once again, Paul would say, well, they're a weaker brother because they're adding on to Scripture. Or they might be going through a fast, or they might be going through, just a season where they're just going, I just want to listen only to Christian music. And so whenever I drive around town, I listen to all types of music. But I would always, and I still do this today, when somebody gets into my car, I'm going to turn it to a Christian radio station out of respect for them, even though I may not agree with their conviction. And once again, you can apply this to all types of different things. And I don't want to break it down because I don't want to get into the weeds. But I want you to remember that our guidance for morality comes first from Scripture. And then from that, we also have conviction, and then we also have counsel of believers. And that's a whole other talk that I can give you. But I want you to understand that we do not need to go above what Scripture tells us. And when there are people around us who do want to go above what Scripture, that we need to respect them as the weaker brother and be in accordance so that we don't cause them to stumble. This is so much information. I hope there's good discussion on this. If you have any questions, I would love to talk.